I know Swaneagle from her many posts on listservs and online as a frontline mom. She is committed to grassroots organizing, overcoming patriarchy both personally and professionally, and living life sustainably. She is an artist and a powerful writer. She worked closely with Indigenous people's rights when most other activists would not even look at the issue, much less touch it. I recall one story of her going to haul water to the family she was working with when the Peabody Coal Company was pumping water out of the aquifer beneath the land to run coal slurry to the south. Swaneagle, can you tell me more about that time?
Yes. Well, Peabody has been mining in the Black Mesa region in northeastern Arizona near the Four Corners since 1969.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They've had, at one time, the largest coal strip mine in the world. Since then, I think mining on all levels has escalated globally. This slurry line used 3 million gallons of pristine water daily from an ancient aquifer called the Black Mesa Aquifer to slurry coal 273 miles away to the Mojave Generating Station, which was the largest coal-fired power plant on Earth until it was shut down in 2005. It was a combination of a failure on their part to put scrubbers on the stacks because it was the single worst source of greenhouse gases on the planet.
Wow.
But they also drained the aquifer.
Wow.
And people who had ancient springs and wells, some of these were ceremonial for both traditional Hopis and traditional Navajo Diné people, as the Navajo call themselves, not only supplied their families with drinking water and their livestock with drinking water and water for basic survival use, but they were used in ceremonies as well.
Wow.
The concept of sacred land, I think, is foreign to most assimilated Americans, though a lot of us feel a connection to the land. I never had seen a cultural frame of reference holding the land sacred until I went down there to live up to 4 months at a time, off and on, especially the 25 years following 1984, and less so in recent time because I've become really a slave to rent. When I was younger, I was able to live essentially rent-free, which enabled me to have the freedom to go and stay on the land for long periods of time. But my first-hand witnessing of the direct results of corporate resource extraction on indigenous people has irrevocably impacted my life and my outlook as an American woman who really, I claim my culture is hippie, and my mother's full-blooded Irish and my father is French and other European mixtures. And I just feel that all of us living on this earth have a sacred duty to pay attention to the sacredness of where we stand. Where we stand is sacred land everywhere. And seeing the damage that isn't even camouflaged or hidden in any way because indigenous people in this country are so expendable was really deeply shocking to me. And I really believed that the situation facing the people of Black Mesa and Big Mountain, which called for the largest forced relocation of indigenous people since the late 1800s, and anywhere from 14 to 16,000 have been relocated, and over half of those relocated since 1986 have died already.
Wow.
And I thought that Americans would rise to the occasion like they did for the civil rights movement.
Yeah, yeah.
That there was a press blackout, and that's when I first really saw just how impossible it is for the voices of indigenous people to be heard.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that. Their rights have largely been invisible to mainstream American society as well as to many activists. And I guess you've told me a little bit of how you've seen that invisibility show up in the work that you've done. But I'm wondering, how have you found ways to combat that?
Well, all I can say that where my success has been is finding very strong, courageous people who've been willing to go down and be of support to the elders that remain on the land. They are the last of an older generation that has maintained their traditional ways, and a lot of their young people have suffered the consequences of forced relocation, though there are some my age that remain out there. But the vibrancy of the culture and the power of the elders and the place of really a prominent position that grandmothers had in this struggle and continue to have was severely diminished by the relocation and untimely deaths of so many of the people. Most of the people I knew during my first years down there are gone.
Oh, I'm so
sorry. And many of them way before their time.
Oh.
And also many non-Indian supporters have died untimely deaths as well. And it's a striking, powerful, almost totally silenced struggle. The scope of the devastation, the numbers of the people impacted, has led me to believe that this situation will be seen only in retrospect as the major human rights violation of the 20th, early 21st centuries in the United States.
Yeah. And
so many Indians are murdered in border towns, and their murders are not solved. Indians are murdered in Seattle, whose murders are not solved. And once I became familiar with the scope of the way slow-motion genocide works, I became vigilant wherever it was I was passing through or visiting in terms of noticing articles in the paper when Indian people were murdered, when Indian women were raped, or when their sacred ceremonies were stopped or disrupted, whether it's in Northern California, in the state of Washington, and the whole scenario that evolved around the killing of the Salish woodcarver John T. Williams, who was deaf in one ear, and a policeman just decided to pick on him and told him to drop his 3-inch carving knife, and John didn't even know he was talking to him. And when he finally turned to face the policeman, he had already shot him several times in the side and in the back.
Oh my gosh.
And that policeman, Ian Burke, never was charged with a crime. The video of this incident shows when Ian Burke first zeroed in on John P. Williams and shows John walking across the intersection, carving on a piece of wood with his 3-inch legal carving knife. And then the policeman just aggressively pursuing him. And the shooting is off camera, but you can hear the shots and a passerby's scream of alarm.
Wow.
And it brought out hundreds and hundreds of Indian people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I went to one of the marches, and it just was no surprise to me what happened, just because of so many of my Indian friends have had friends or close relatives murdered, and their killers were never apprehended, and the killers overwhelmingly white men.
Mm-hmm.
And and there's also some very deeply seated racism among most Americans based on ignorance, and it has variations depending on somebody's education or lack of deeply held bigotry. That does make a difference, but for the most part, all of us raised in this society have been damaged by racist attitudes.
Yeah.
So it takes some real, not only self-educating, but exercising the tools, some fabulous tools that are out there that help people deconstruct attitudes that most of us were raised with.
Mm-hmm.
And then really the best way to find out what's happening with Indigenous people is to find out where their communities are based and find ways of building relationships with traditional people, with those who hold their cultures closest to their hearts and way of life. In the 1930s, the United States established Indian Reorganization Act in order to create legitimized forms of governance, giving access to resources discovered on unwanted Indian lands, reservations in the 1920s, where they Standard Oil in particular discovered oil, shale, uranium, and coal. And once they created these legitimized governments, the tribal councils, then they had a way to work with the Indians that were willing to sell their culture and their people out to gain access to the resources.
Wow.
And in some cases, tribal councils have represented the interests of traditional people, but for the most part, they've become vehicles for capitalism and resource extraction.
Wow.
And the way that blood quantum and tribal governments are constructed exclude people who do not have the paperwork or the continuity of residence to prove their membership in certain tribes. And then a lot of Indian people were displaced, orphaned. There's just a myriad of reasons of what has been done to break up families. And once they lose that root to the land, then it's very easy for who they are to not be legitimized by the U.S. government.
Wow.
And the systems that have been constructed by the invader have done everything they can to decrease the numbers of the people and decrease the voices who oppose the raping of the land for resources and profit.
Wow.
And what I found by being with traditional people, including Thomas Binyaka, Hopi man who was very supportive of the resistance at Big Mountain, is that laws are in place on the reservation to make it illegal for non-Indians to visit with or stay with traditional peoples. So it has to be people with a very strong sense of determination and who are not easily swayed, who make the effort to go to the source.
What? So, in other words, it's illegal for me to go and visit with Indians on a reservation and make connections?
Well, it depends on where you're going. What happened as a result of thousands of non-Indians over the years spending time at Big Mountain and bearing witness to the human rights violations, documenting it, and getting arrested. I got arrested out there twice. Is that they, and also I've done several peace camps that were declared illegal, and they passed an exclusion act to exclude non-Indians from being support to traditional people. I did it anyway, and they threatened to arrest me because I had an illegal structure, which was a tent with a tarp over it and an outhouse that the wind blew over, and they threatened to arrest me. And as soon as Pauline saw that, we went to a medicine man, and a ceremony was conducted, and they never bothered me again. I have not been out there for that length of time since 2000. It was the last time I was there for several months. The last time I went out was in 2010 for a week with a group of young people who we did work parties to help elders get ready for the winter, and brought tools and food and warm clothes. But once my daughter started school, my youngest, and it just, which she was 13 at the time, and so that was in 2003 or 4. No, actually it was later than that, 2006. She went to school for 1 year in Eastern Washington, and then the racism that she experienced was so deplorable that we had to leave. And then we moved to Western Washington, and I wasn't able to find a cabin like I was able to live in Eastern Washington. It's illegal over here to have outhouses and to live the way I was living there. It's illegal in Eastern Washington, too. It's just that thousands of people live that way, and I suppose it'll take them a while to stop everybody if they ever succeed at doing that.
Right. And maybe it's not a priority. I recently heard a talk by James Anaya, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And he emphasized two things that really stood out to me that the Native American people in the U.S. need for healing, which is control of their land and a national conversation about the historic implications of colonization on their well-being today.
Fabulous.
And he specifically called for truth and reconciliation without vilification. Can you speak to that? What do you think the Native American people really need?
Well, what people have told me ever since I first started becoming involved was return the land.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that nobody expects the entire United States to be returned, but in just the ongoing theft of Indian lands has never stopped, and the Allotment Act divided up land, put it in the names of certain families, some of them were pressured in different ways to sell it, and that really broke the backbone of a lot of reservations. Wow. And there's just so many insidious laws that have been passed that have given more ways for corporations and others to gain access to land, like ranchers in South Dakota, and the way the Black Hills were taken.
Yeah.
There's just so many stories. It's so extensive, and there's so many tribes. There's hundreds of tribes in this country, and there's still dozens that speak their own languages, and many that are trying to reclaim their languages.
Yeah.
And those stories need to be told. And there needs to be a systematic way of documenting the stories that people need to know in whatever region of this country that they live. The way you investigated your story with the photographs about the people in the region where you are, Georgia, right?
Yes, yes.
Is really, really moving. I haven't had time to really read every, I read what, I didn't click on any of the pictures and go into the deep detail that what you've been doing deserves. But it definitely stirred my interest, and it's something I'd like to see, because you already are opening your heart to this story. And it's people who are moved in this direction that are so crucial to the truth being told. And people need, like what I'm trying to do on Vashon, is get some land that we were able to stop a huge gravel mine operation from being developed. It was some civil disobedience I did with mostly young people in 2009.
Uh-huh.
And finally the coal company gave up and sold the land to the state. And the state has declared it a park, and it's adjoining an already pretty significantly a couple 100-acre park, and so it'll be over 400 acres. And what is really interesting is the river, the creek that flows through that land, is one of the only places left in the Puget Sound where the Chinook salmon return.
Wow.
And the Shamamish people, who were absorbed by the Nisqually and the Puyallup tribes, still have fishing rights around that creek.
Yes.
And I believe part, if not all, of that land should be returned to the Shamamish people.
Yes.
And that is really controversial on an island that's overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly privileged people. And many of them believe the myth that the Indians never were here.
Oh, wow.
They're not even really dealing with the fact that the Japanese, who excelled growing strawberries out here, were rounded up during the Second World War and never got their land back.
Wow.
And so there's some real history of theft that needs to be addressed on Vashon. And I do believe it would take a team of people with certain skills to be able to take this on, whereas most of the people that are here feel lucky to live here, and they don't want their feelings about being here dented with the notion of the fact they're on stolen land.
Yeah.
And I think that's a difficult thing for most people. But I think in the case of the reservations, that the lands that are being raped and pillaged right now for uranium, for coal, for the tar sands, it's the same blueprint in Canada as it is here, as only as the further south you go, the outright slaughter of Indian people accelerates.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the effort to get gold and silver and copper. And there's just stories that all these different Indian tribes are facing death squads.
Wow. Wow.
And one of the most striking that comes to mind is Newmont Mining, which has an abandoned uranium mine on the Spokane Reservation. And my friends and I did our best to bring attention to the uncovered tailings pond adjoining the reservation, as well as the uranium mine that we just drove up to and took photographs of the deer tracks and coyote tracks through the seepages of water running through the yellow cake uranium tailings that were in canyons.
Gosh.
And the only thing that indicated that this was a uranium mine was a nuclear symbol nailed on a tree when we drove in there. The gate was wide open.
Oh my gosh.
And all the elders who live around that uranium mine have died of cancer. There isn't one elder left. And it finally made the Sunday weekly paper of the Seattle Times, 3 or 4 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Newmont Mining is trying to put in a massive gold mine in Ecuador and use the lakes in the Andes to leach the gold that'll have arsenic in it.
Oh my gosh.
And they're already killing Indian people there. And the government is, and I mean, there's an article in a hold on, I'm going to run, can I run and get this magazine that has the article I'm telling you about?
Sure.
Okay, just a second. The magazine's called One Earth, and it's the National Resource Defense Council winter 2012-2013 issue. It's called Buried Treasure. Giant mining companies are tearing up some of the wildest places on Earth to feed our hunger for gold.
Wow.
But do we even need it?
Wow.
And it's Laguna Azul is one of 4 high-altitude Andean lakes that may be drained to make way for the $4.8 billion Conga Gold and Copper Mine, which is owned by Newmont Mining Corporation of Denver.
Wow. Wow. And it's so crazy because I think one of our biggest natural resources that we're really going to require is fresh water.
That's exactly right.
I mean, it makes no sense.
No, it doesn't. And when you look, this is in Peru, the Peruvian highlands.
Uh-huh.
And saying that, is like with Peabody Coal and the aquifer. And here's the other thing. Once the Black Mesa aquifer was drained, Peabody immediately wanted to go for another aquifer. And they were going to reconfigure the slurry line away from the Mojave Generating Station in Laughlin, Nevada, to Page, Arizona, where they already have coal-fired power plants and where they want to build another one.
Wow.
And recently, the Navajo Tribal Council was willing to hand over the water rights to the state of Arizona, which means they would, in turn, give permission to Peabody to tap into the other aquifer.
Wow.
And the people came out by the hundreds opposing this.
Oh, thank goodness.
And they're never listened to. Obama's never met with any of the traditional people. Neither did Clinton. I just saw every time another guy was voted in office, all the way since 1984, when I first started going down there.
Uh-huh.
Nobody ever came to talk to the elders of Big Mountain.
Wow.
And I saw this community shrink and devastated by relocation and death. And I mean, how could 14 to 16,000, actually 20,000 people were impacted by this, be so invisible?
It's horrifying.
It is.
It's horrifying.
To me, it presented the perfect example of what slow motion genocide is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Violence Against Women Act that finally was passed, that the Republicans tried to eliminate protections for Native American women and immigrants. But for once, they didn't get their way. But to me, that is a perfect indicator of it shines a light on what slow motion genocide is. And I would like to write a piece just about that.
Yes. Yeah.
And once you destroy the women, like the indigenous say, when the women's hearts are on the ground, that's the end of the people.
Yeah. Yeah. And the level of violence against the women is horrifying. I read James Anaya's report, and I know that something like 80% of the rapes perpetrated against the indigenous women are by non-indigenous people.
Yes.
And
white men. And they also marry Indian women, beat them up, and kill them.
Yeah.
And that's the majority of who's killing Indian women.
Yeah. Now, you did read the apology from Congress.
I did.
And it seemed like you had a strong reaction to that. Can you tell me a little more about your response to that that resolution?
I think it's really striking how they qualify what Indians they are including. And they make it very clear that boundaries and tribal affiliations are very crucial, that people outside those contexts have no concern as far as his apology goes.
Wow. Yeah.
The invaders, they called Sand Creek and Wounded Knee armed conflicts. They were massacres. None of those people in either of those cases had a weapon. None of the Lakota people at Wounded Knee, and I can't remember the tribes at Sand Creek, none of those people had weapons. It was not armed conflict. They were pure and simple massacres.
Wow. Wow.
And I think its language would be an insult even to Indian people that aren't traditional, because there's a lot of Indian people who successfully assimilated, who know their history and don't agree with now this wording, this apology is all coming from people who know that something wrong was done, but they do everything they can to minimize the truth of what really happened. And the invaders brought guns, alcohol, and disease. And all those things were used intentionally to kill the people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, of course, they mention the boarding schools, but recently they're uncovering graves on the lands of the boarding schools with the bodies of Indian children. And I'll look for some of the links. I could send you some of the, and recently I asked for my phone bill to be lessened by giving up caller ID and message machine and long distance. Well, I think they also made it so I can't live stream the radio stations that I listen to that are very important for my research and the work I do. And I feel like we have a window that's closing down on us because I can't get access to a lot of things on the internet anymore. It's just constricting.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important to find this information and be able to act on it before we don't have a way of gaining access to it. There are Indian people in Canada that have been very effective in getting the word out about the killings of Indian children and an extensive molestation, which is what happened in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there's a really egregious crime of, what's the word I'm trying to, they're not addressing, they're silencing the seriousness of the crimes done against Indian people in this apology, which means it's not an authentic apology.
Yeah.
And whoever crafted it is either confining themselves to the superficial information provided to those with corporate interests at heart, or they really just are displaying really the ignorance of the society at large.
Yeah, yeah.
And that keeps people from ever having to take seriously the racism and the genocidal actions of a white supremacist culture, which this didn't start out that way, but it certainly is what it has ended up being in these times.
Yes. Well, yeah. Well, thank you, Swaneagle. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share tonight?
Well, I think that one of the things that I wanted to share is that those who have been relocated from Big Mountain, Black Mesa region to give access to Peabody expanding their coal mine, many of them have been relocated to lands called the New Lands near Chambers and Sanders, Arizona. The water source is a Rio Puerco River that was contaminated by highly radioactive liquid when United Nuclear's Church Rock Dam burst. And these highly radioactive contaminants were spilled into the river, and that's the water source for the New Lands, where people are birthing deformed babies and dying of cancer.
Oh no.
Their livestock, deformed lambs and calves and horses, and dying of cancer. These are just, this spill has been called second only to Chernobyl in terms of damage done.
Yeah.
And most people don't know about this either.
Right. No, I'd never heard of it. So.
And Helen Caldecott had a film about uranium mines, and she had a piece in there. I saw this years ago, but she had a part in there talking about the fact that this one particular region of the Navajo Reservation had the highest uranium radiation-related birth defects of anywhere in the Western Hemisphere.
Wow.
And these are things that beg research and investigation by well-funded journalists of conscience.
Yes.
And I wanted to investigate the killings by white supremacists of Indian people in the border towns around, Church Rock not Church Rock, Shiprock, Gallup, and Farmington, New Mexico. A lot of the things I'm telling you, people can Google them, and I do believe what I'm telling you, you can just Google phrases of what I'm saying, and you can verify and begin to see the resources that are out there that will give people more information about what I'm talking about. And there's an EPA Superfund webpage that mentions the 521 abandoned, uncovered uranium mines still on the Navajo reservation as they continue to put in new uranium mines, including in the Grand Canyon on the lands of the Havasupai people. And then there is an article in the LA Times from February 2004 that currently is not available unless you pay. But if you Google that and pay however much they want you to pay, it's from the Los Angeles Times archive, and it's called Her Life Belongs to the Land. And it's about Pauline Whitesinger, my dear friend and my life's greatest teacher. And she's who has led this resistance among other strong women. But she was one of those to first take a stand, as were several other women. And there's a book by Jerry Kamer called The Second Long Walk. And it's about the struggle at Big Mountain. And there's also a documentary that won an Academy Award in 1986 called Broken Rainbow. And it gives information that existed around the issue in 1986. But unfortunately, there aren't any current follow-ups to really examine the scope of the devastation.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, especially in pointing us to those resources online and in the media. I feel like the media has a huge role to play if we are to have this national dialogue. And I really appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions tonight and be interviewed for my blog. And I will let you know when the blog is up.
Thank you so much, Beth, and I just appreciate your interest so much. It's so important, and I feel like your heart's in the right place, and I just feel like doors are going to open, so these stories will unfold for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Swaneagle.
Yeah, thank you, Beth.